Okay, so we have a little argument here. Most philosophers admire Socrates. Some philosophers study logic. So some philosophers both admire Socrates and study logic. And the question we're going to consider is whether the inference step from these premises 1 and 2 to this conclusion 3 is deductively valid. Now, the answer to that question depends on whether it is possible in the sense of at least coherently imaginable, to have a situation where these premises are true and yet this conclusion is not. Now, if you think about it for a little bit, and I'll go through it in more detail in a moment, but if you think about it for a little bit, it's pretty clear that it is possible, it certainly is imaginable, to have a situation where these premises are true and yet this conclusion isn't, and therefore that makes this an instance of invalid reasoning. These premises do not entail this conclusion. Okay, now to really convince ourselves of that, we have to really convince ourselves that we can envision a scenario where these premises are true and yet this conclusion is not. In order to do that, we might imagine we have all the philosophers. And now let's imagine that this first premise is true. Most of the philosophers admire Socrates. Now, crucially, in order to imagine that this first premise is true, we don't have to imagine that all the philosophers admire Socrates, just a significant percentage, let's say 75%. If we imagined that 75% of the philosophers admire Socrates, that would make this first premise true, and it would still leave some philosophers not admiring Socrates. So let's imagine that 75% of the philosophers admire Socrates, and let's sort of herd them off to one side here. And over here, we have the philosophers that don't admire Socrates. Okay, now let's imagine this second premise being true as well, that some philosophers study logic, while trying to imagine this conclusion being false. So to do that, we can say, okay, well, let's take some of these philosophers that don't admire Socrates and make some of them be philosophers that study logic. And if we make only them, only some in this group, be studiers of logic, then we'll have most philosophers admiring Socrates, some studying logic, and no one both admiring Socrates and studying logic. So it would look like this. So in this scenario that we've envisioned, it's true that most philosophers admire Socrates, and it's true that some of the philosophers study logic, but we don't have any philosopher that both admires Socrates and studies logic, so this conclusion is false. So this shows that we can envision a scenario where these premises are true and this conclusion is false, and thus this is not valid reasoning. Okay, so here we have another example. This time the argument goes, if abortion is permissible, then infanticide is permissible, but infanticide is not permissible, so abortion is not permissible. Now, there are a few different questions one could ask about this argument, but for now, let's just focus on the question that we did for the previous argument, which is the inference step from these two premises to this conclusion deductively valid? Again, that's to ask whether it's possible to have a situation where these premises are true, but this conclusion is false. And this time, if we think about it, we should see that the answer is no. That's not possible. One way to see that is to consider these two premises, 1 and 2, along with the claim that abortion is permissible. So just consider these three claims that I've grouped together here. The key thing to recognize here is that those three claims together are not consistent. Those cannot all be true, right? Because if what I've labeled claim 0 here, abortion is permissible, is true, and claim 1 are both true, those two things together, of course, imply that infanticide is permissible, which contradicts claim 2. So claims 0, 1, and 2 cannot all be true at the same time. But that means that if claims 1 and 2 were true, then claim 0 would have to be false because they can't all be true at once. So, in other words, if claim 1 and claim 2 were both true, the claim that abortion is permissible would be wrong. In other words, it would be true that abortion is not permissible, which is the very conclusion of this argument. So that's a way of demonstrating that if these premises were true, that would force this conclusion to be true. So the inference step here is deductively valid. Now, like I said, that's only one question we can ask about this argument, is whether the inference step is deductively valid, and it is. That doesn't settle whether this is overall a good argument. It means that in one crucial respect, this argument is well constructed. The conclusion does follow from the premises. In order for this to be an overall good argument or a sound argument, the premises also have to actually be true. And of course, one could question, say, the truth in particular of this first premise. If abortion is permissible, then infanticide is permissible. Obviously, it's possible to disagree with that and say, no, abortion being permissible doesn't mean infanticide, which is a very different thing, is also permissible. Okay, here's a different kind of problem. This time, we are supposed to give an example of an argument where the premises deductively entail the conclusion, and the premises are false, and the conclusion is false. Now, there are a number of different ways you could approach this problem. In this case, what I think I'll do is start by picking a false statement to act as my conclusion. So let's say San Francisco is the capital of California. That's false because Sacramento is the capital of California. Now I need to pick premises that are also false and which entail this conclusion. Now, one thing I could do here, which is technically gives me a correct answer, but it's a little bit of a trick, is I could just take this same statement that I have intended as my conclusion and also make it the premise of my argument. So I could do this. And here, my conclusion is false. My premise is false. And this premise does deductively entail this conclusion because there's no possible scenario where this premise is true and this conclusion is false because they're one and the same. So obviously, I can never have a situation where this is true and this is false. So this technically would work. That feels a little bit tricksy, even though technically it's correct. So let me go with something different. So what I could do, one thing I could try is pick some characteristic that San Francisco doesn't have, like, say, being the most populous city in California, right? That is not San Francisco. That would be Los Angeles. So if I say San Francisco is the most populous city in California, that's false. And perhaps I could combine that with something that together would entail that SF is the capital of California. And one way I could do that is by saying, well, every state, its capital is its most populous city. That's also false. But if I combined that with this, it would entail this. So I will add as my last premise, every state has its most populous city as its capital. Okay, so the first two statements here are my premises, and then from them, I'm concluding SF is the capital of California. This meets the conditions that were asked for in the problem because my premises and my conclusion are all false. And moreover, these premises deductively entail this conclusion. It's not possible to have a scenario where these premises are true and yet this is still false. So while these are in fact all false, if these premises were true, that would make this conclusion true. Okay, here's another problem of the same type, but just slightly different. This time we're trying to give an argument where the premises deductively entail the conclusion, but this time we want the conclusion being true and the premises being false. So let's start with picking a true statement as our conclusion. Maybe let's try Sacramento is the capital of California. So that's a true statement. Let's have that as our target conclusion. And now we need to pick premises that are false, but that do entail this conclusion. So premises which are not actually true, but were they true, they would guarantee the truth of this. Now it occurs to me that I could use my premises from the previous problem again. I just have to modify one of them a little bit. So I could start with the same first premise as last time. And now for my second premise, if I say Sacramento is the most populous city in California rather than San Francisco, then I will have a pair of premises that do entail this conclusion. So it's not possible to have a scenario where these premises are true and yet this conclusion is false. So these premises do entail this conclusion, which happens to be true, even though both of these premises are actually false. So this is an example of an argument where I've gotten myself to a conclusion that is correct, even though the premises I started from are false. So I've luckily gotten myself to something true from two things that are false. Okay, here's another problem of this same type. So this time I want to again have the premises entail the conclusion, but this time I want the premises and the conclusion to all be true. So let me start with that same conclusion again. Sacramento is the capital of California. That's true. And now I need to pick some premises which actually are true and which do entail this. So let's see. One thing that occurs to me is I could pick a statement like the capital of California is the home of the state capitol building. That's true. And then if I add that the home of the state capitol building is Sacramento, that's also true. So these two premises are true and they do entail this conclusion. There's no possible scenario where both of these first two claims are true and yet this third claim is wrong. So we've satisfied again all the things that are being asked for in the problem. Okay, finally we have another example of this type of problem where we're supposed to give an argument where the premises entail the conclusion and the premises are true and the conclusion is false. Well, if we think about that, actually the answer is that that can't be done, because if the premises entail the conclusion, that means there's no possible scenario, no scenario we can even coherently imagine where the premises are true and the conclusion is not. So we can't construct an argument where the premises entail the conclusion and the premises are actually true and the conclusion is actually false, because that's precisely this type of scenario that isn't possible if the premises entail the conclusion. So the answer we would put here is just not possible.